Portledge Manor. The place in England where the Pine Coffin family originated. It has been in the Coffin family for 9 centuries. Come with me as we go back and trace the American coffin history from 1066 to 1845, starting with Portledge, and then to Brixton, and then to Newbury, and on to Nantucket. Few families can claim a 900-year continuous heritage dating back to when William the Conqueror came from Normandy and seized the crown of England. If we backtrack for a moment to 400 AD, we will remember that the Roman Empire was starting to crumble. The Roman legions were being drawn from Britain to stem the barbarian tide in Europe and were never to return. The Saxons became the next group of people to rule England and to evolve into a Christian, prosperous kingdom, only to be attacked after 800 AD by invading Vikings. Finally, Edward the Confessor, a religious, celibate king, ruled a united England. He died in 1066 without children, thus setting the stage for the conquest of England. The famous Bayeux Tapestry, embroidered in wool on a 230-foot-long strip of linen, was commissioned in 1070 by Bishop Odo of Bayeux in Normandy. He was one of William's half-brothers. It tells the story of the conquest. Now we see Harold of England on an embassy, swearing his allegiance to William, Duke of Normandy. Then, in 1066, Edward dies without an heir. Harold is immediately crowned King of England in spite of his oath to William. Next is shown William assembling his fleet to invade England. And after landing, he dines with his half-brother Odoa and Robert Mortain. In the Battle of Hastings, the Norman knights attack Harold's personal guard. In our final view, we see Harold being killed by a knight on horseback. In 1066, William the Conqueror became ruler of England, and he spent the next 20 years putting down Saxon revolts. And each time he did, he gave the estates of the rebellious to his followers. The Coffins came over with William's armies as supporters of Robert, Count of Mortain, and from him received Alwington, which later became known as Portledge. In 1086, William commissioned the Domesday Book. This was a very detailed, combined census and tax roll, so detailed that the Saxons likened it to the last day of judgment. It lists who owned each estate in the time of Edward the Confessor, who owned it in 1086, and how much woodland, plowland, and meadowland it contained. It listed how many people by social class and how many domestic animals. It was written in a highly abbreviated medieval Latin by one scribe. Using the 1986 900th anniversary edition of the Domesday Book, we see the actual page where Alwington is listed. The Domesday Book became and remains the basis of modern English land titles. It is written on parchment and remains in remarkable preservation. In 1086, the name given for Portledge was Hamlin. English counties or shires were and are divided into parishes. The parish is Alwington and is plainly legible as the parish name as it is today. The previous Saxon owner's name was Ordwulf. It is listed under the holdings of the Count of Mortain, who we remember was Duke William's half-brother. He received most of Cornwall and the majority of Devon. He in turn parceled it out to his supporters, amongst whom was the first coffin. Tradition has the first coffin coming from Falaise in Normandy, where William was born. The first written use of the name Coffin was about 1120. Once the coffins were established at Portledge, centuries went by and generations of coffins followed each other. Gradually, the name Portledge emerged with many variant spellings. During this time, quantities of documents accumulated: leases, deeds, wills, indentures, mostly written in Latin. Many were sold to pay taxes in the middle of the last century. However, many still exist in the Public Record Office in Exeter, where the printed catalog is 4 bound volumes. Portledge Manor is located in North Devon on Barnstable Bay, 4 miles west of Bidford. You enter through pineapple-topped gateposts and then follow a half-mile winding drive through woods of oak, beech, laurel, and rhododendron. It is most picturesquely situated in a little valley with a brook running down to the sea, surrounded by high rolling hillside, meadows dotted with sheep and horses. In front of you is the manor house, which has been operated by the family as a delightful hotel. A path leads down to the sea through Primrose, to the surf breaking on a rocky shore. The old road is still easily traceable, running diagonally down to the sea. On the bluff, we see the old Norman bridge that carried the road over the brook as it flows into the sea. Portledge is comprised of about 800 acres with a large frontage on the bay. The manor house is the most interesting statement of the history of the manor. The oldest portion still standing is the Norman Tower, dating to about 1150 A.D., and is the former front entrance, now on the rear. Let's listen as Susan Coffin talks about it.
He altered the whole of this and built a guard wing here for his guards with pikes and halberds, the great tall staves with pikes on the end, and that was his guardhouse. And you could ride in here from the gap that was there, and this was the backyard to the original ancient house. That's its back wall, and this was the backyard which was open to the sky. You could ride in there, and these are all outside walls. And this is the thickness of the outside wall. This was a big fireplace, a great big Elizabethan fireplace, which is rather sad that it was taken away, which was before our time. And so this would have been a room with beautiful proportions and very cozy, big fire glowing in the corner, and nice proportions, and through to a cozy little sitting room which they used to use in the mornings when there were just a few of them. And here we have the great staircase, which is 1680. It's in those days that before that they had little short wooden staircases in several different places in the house, just little short runs of stairs up from different sections, and they decided to make a very grand big staircase with all this beautiful carving. They've all got coat of arms on all the corners of the bossings. It's very much decorated. Here we come to the first dining room. Used to be the original family dining room, and this is the thickness of the outside wall, which was pushed through when it was turned into a hotel. That is the thickness of the wall, which was a Norman wall, and then this was built on in the 1700s, this big room for entertaining. And that plasterwork is 1820 Italian craftsmen. They are refugees of the time. They brought their tools with them, and they used to go around and exchange for board and lodging, doing ceilings in houses where anyone was willing to employ them in exchange for board and lodging. These little stairs went up to the balcony, which hung over the great hall, and the balcony was for the women who were not welcome on the floor downstairs. And this is where the women would go and listen to music, which they had music and singing from the minstrels' gallery. And this is the long gallery where it was all one great long room and was used in bad weather for the women and children to exercise in and play little games, do dancing. And this is all 1600s plasterwork, all the flowers of the time. And that one is all the fruit of the time. And here is oranges stuck with cloves, which is called a pomander, which people hung on their waistband because everything was rather strongly scented in those days. Nobody really washed as well as they might. And there was no deodorants or any modern conveniences, so everything was rather highly scented. So they used to have the cloves stuck in oranges to give them a little fresh perfume. But there are beautiful lilies and roses up on the ceiling. And on each corner, when I first saw it, I thought it was a ribbon binding the garland, but it is actually a face. And it is the face of the medieval green man of the woods, which is very mythological, slightly sinister, the tales of the woodman, as it was called in medieval times. And there's the coat of arms of the gentleman who, the Coffin, who lived here at the time. The door to this room can only be opened from the inside. So in times of trouble, the women and children used to come up here and bolt the door. And it's of 3 different thicknesses of wood, the grain going in different directions. So it's difficult to break down with an axe. And they used to come up here when galloping down the drive would come the opposing side. And we often think that they must have had 2 flags here to wait and see who was galloping down the drive, and then they could run up the flag of whoever was coming down the drive, because in order to still have the property through all the troubled times, we think they must have hopped from one side to the other. And this goes on up and up and up to a little place in the late 1800s when the top was put on the house. For they were called the tweenies, and they worked between stairs, and they had to get all their work done before the family was up and about in the morning, crack of dawn, polishing the stairs and the furniture and clearing out the fires, and were never allowed to be seen in the main rooms once the family had got up. Now we go through to the balcony. But anyway, this is the back wall of the first house, and this was the open courtyard, which somebody in their wisdom decided to drop a little house into the gap at the end to block off the gap. They wanted more rooms for their endless children, all the nannies and nursemaids, and so they dropped the little house in there, blocked off the entrance, and then a few years later somebody said, well, why don't we roof it in and make an interior courtyard. This we call the armadas, because the tale is that the timbers that were dragged up off the beach when the wrecks of the Spanish Armada galleons were drifting up from the sea, they pulled them all up off the beach and used the timbers to make extra housing here. And these great timbers and all this black woodwork here, these are great keel timbers from the ships. The keel timbers were wallowing about in the ocean. They get swept up onto the beach. This one is a great mishmash of history because it was built originally as a chapel. Somebody decided to turn it into a kitchen, so they had the fireplace and they used this as a kitchen. And that is the bell tower, which was used to ring at certain times of the day to echoes right round the countryside and tells all the people working in the fields what time of day it is, when to stop and have their sandwiches. This one is a very, very, very old. It's before the coffins came, I think. It's a Saxon arch. One was the dairy, one was the buttery. Upstairs was the still room where they made concoctions of herbs for medicines. All the spring and summer they would be making concoctions of herbs which they could use in the winter against bruises and cuts and strains and coughs. And I don't think they were very healthy in those days, reading through old records. They were always using unguents, as they call them, for their rheumy eyes and coughs and complaints. They were all made here. This one is up on arches and was used to keep the hops in. They used to grow their own hops to make beer, and it was up on arches to keep the rats out of the hops. And this little room is where they made the beer. This great shed was where they kept their dairy cows. And this is the monks' cell. The monasteries and the abbots were very powerful, and they allowed certain houses to have a monk on their premises to run the chapel. You can see the wonderful jumble of roofs, and if you look carefully you can see where different coloured bricks, where they have added on new houses, where the colour of the bricks change. That is all the red brick, which was the very early house, and somebody decided to build a new chunk on there. Where I live at the moment is the coach house, where they kept the coaches and the horses, great big horses to pull these quite heavy, substantial coaches, which the High Sheriff used to drive in to get to Exeter. And subsequently they just had the little horse and carriage, which before motor cars they used to go to Bideford in, 4 miles away. And because the drive is quite steep, the family had to get out and walk up the drive, too much for the horse to pull. You can see the shape of the first tower, that first square grey bit there is the first tower, the first bit that they ever built. And then was added on the little red one. Sort of little separate houses dropped in and just joined on. That on the left of the door is the Great Hall, which went from floor to ceiling. And they had the balcony where the women could look. I showed you the steps up to the balcony from inside. The balcony where the women could look down into the hall and the minstrel's gallery. The windows on the tower were used as a guardhouse. The wall that you see up there goes round in a square and was made for a purpose. It was a barricade, and this is the new wing someone decided to build in the 1700s.
From the start, Portledge has been the manor and Alwington the parish. The Church of St. Andrews is very close by and has always been very closely associated with the Coffin and Pine Coffin family. There are many memorials as we see here. The Coffin family pew, which is no longer in use because the family sits with the congregation, is opposite the chancel on the right. It is the old minstrel gallery from the former Great Hall. The origins of the church are Saxon, with much rebuilding over the centuries. It is delightful, the typical English country church, still with an active congregation. The Coffins of Portledge grew to be one of the most influential manors in Devon during the Middle Ages. This map shows the various parishes operated from Portledge. The present owners of Portledge are Colonel T.J. Pine Coffin and his wife Susan. Both were born in India. Their fathers were officers in the Royal Indian Army. It was his grandmother who was the last family member to live in the manor house in the grand old style. When she died in 1928, the buildings were leased privately until after World War II, and since then used as a most attractive 4-star small hotel for some 70 guests. To stay there is to experience the very best gracious elegance. The family also operates a dairy, milking 180 cows and a feedlot for 200 bullocks. Their son, Adrian Pine Coffin, married to Gabrielle, have 2 sons, Tristram and Benjamin, so there are 2 more Coffin generations already born. Their 2 daughters, Julia with 3 daughters, and Sarah with 2 daughters and a son, and their husbands also live on the estate. The family name became Pine Coffin when in the 18th century there was no male heir, and under the English law of primogeniture, the eldest daughter's husband from a neighboring family named Pine added Coffin to his name. The coat of arms on the wall of the Alwington Parish Church is quartered, Pine and Coffin. Separating the conquest in 1066 from our immigrant ancestor Tristram, possibly 22 generations passed. During that time, there must have been many younger sons settling in the region. The name became well established in Devon and surrounding areas. Tristram was born on the Butlaw's farm near Brixton, 5 miles east of Plymouth on the south coast of Devon. The farm is still in operation. However, the house he was born in is now represented by a ruined corner. The present barns may well date to his lifetime. The local farmers to this day still refer to the adjacent area as Coffin's Fields. The British Ordnance map shows the farm, location of the field, and the village of Brixton. Brixton is a typical rural English village with St. Mary's Church in the center, of which Tristram was an active member. A seating plan showing his pew survives. The church was considerably abused by Cromwell's Puritan Roundheads, who stabled their horses in it during the siege of Plymouth Castle in 1642. The columns are scarred by the horses. The Roundheads had little use for the Church of England. They used the church records to make their cartridges, which illustrates the fate of many such records. Tristram's brother John died in the siege, and the events of that year led to the immigration of Tristram and all of his family. Tristram's father Peter also was born in Brixton in 1584. His widow Joan accompanied by Tristram with 2 unmarried sisters on the voyage to America. Tristram's grandfather Nicholas, also from Brixton, was born in 1568. His father, another Peter, was apparently married to Marie Boscawen. She was born in 1551 and is commemorated by a brass plaque in the floor of St. Michael's Church at Pennicaville near Truro, Cornwall. If the identification is correct, we are descended from the Carmano family, the most powerful clan in Cornwall throughout the Middle Ages. One theory is that Peter Coffin was the son of the James Coffin of Portledge, who died in 1566. However, this has not been documented. The problem is that most parish registers do not go back that far. Tristram must have decided to sail for America after he figured there was little future in Cromwell's Puritan England, as he presumably had royalist sympathies and had fought on the king's side. Tristram sailed with his wife, Dionys Stevens, who was with child, and their 5 children, Peter, Tristram Jr., Elizabeth, James, and baby John. They sailed in a ship belonging to Robert Clement, a friend of Tristram's. The ship was, no doubt, very similar to the reconstructed Mayflower, small, cranky, top-heavy. They had trouble beating against the prevailing westerlies. Quarters were cramped and crowded, with cooked food a luxury of calm days. The trip probably took at least 2 months. They lost the baby John, and little Deborah, probably born prematurely, lived only 3 weeks. An interesting sidelight, the mate of the Mayflower, Robert Coffin, sometimes spelled C-O-P-P-E-N, was also from Plymouth. He was the only person other than the master who had previously been to New England. It was he who showed the Pilgrim Fathers Plymouth Harbor. Our story now shifts to America, and to New England in particular. Tristram and his family landed near Salisbury, Massachusetts, a very small town on the north side of the mouth of the Merrimack River. Soon, he bought from the Indians a tract of land at Nantucket, now Averill, only 10 miles up the river. It's illustrative how thin the fringe of English settlement was 22 years after the Pilgrims first landed. 2 more children were born in Averill. Mary, who later was to be so very influential in the affairs of Nantucket, and a second John to replace the John who died as a result of the voyage. By 1650, the family had moved back down the river to Newbury. They were now of importance in the settlement. Dionys ran an ordinary, a place of refreshment for travelers. Tristram had a license to run a ferry across the Merrimack to Rings Island near Salisbury, still known as Coffin's Point. At Newbury was born Stephen in 1653, their 9th and last child. Tristram was 43. It's ironic that the erstwhile Royalist and Church of England adherent should flee Puritan-dominated England to settle in Puritan-dominated New England. The Coffin House in Newbury was really more the home of Tristram Jr., apprenticed to a tailor. He married the young widow of his master, who suddenly died. Tristram Sr. appears to have lived here a short time before leaving for Nantucket. The house we see is largely the work of Tristram Jr. and his descendants. The house is located on High Street, immediately east of the town line with Newburyport. It is next door to the First Parish Church, which had been relocated to this location in 1645 from Old Newbury. Across the street lies the old burying ground where many coffins lie. The house has been restored and is open to the public.
So what we'll be seeing as we go through the house is a family that lived here for 3 centuries, and we'll be focusing around 1650, 1750, and 1850. When the house was first built, it was the post-medieval style. Is kind of like the English Tudor today. It's the exposed brick, mortar, and beams. And this door that you see in front of you was the front door of the original house. Tristram Jr. and Judith lived in this one room. Family life centered in front of the fireplace. They did their eating, their cooking, their socializing, everything in this one room. And they also had 10 children, so there was 12 of them at that time who lived in this room. A lot of us think when we see these large fireplaces that they had one large roaring fire, where actually at that time they would have had 4 or 5 small fires going at the same time, cooking different things. You'd never find any closets in a 1600 home, and they always had chests to hold their linens and the few clothing that they had. And this chest here in the corner came with the family in the 1600s from England. As time went on, they did put up walls for certain reasons, and they made this corner room the pantry, where the family would have kept their food, pots and pans, cooking utensils. So this is the upstairs of the original house. And again, it was maybe 1 or 2 rooms when it was first built, and they added walls at a later date for more privacy. All the family would have done up here at that time was sleep. You would have only found beds up here. You might have also found extra lumber and grains. It was also used as storage. And at that time, you would have seen many chairs lining the walls. They also did receive visitors up here. At that time, because of the lack of space, maybe you would have found 4 or 5 children or people sleeping in the same bed for warmth. This is an adult cradle. Because you would have found 3 generations living together, they didn't have elderly homes or nursing homes at that time. This was for the elderly or the invalids of the family to sleep in. So for the rest of the house that you see, it's the 1725 edition. So in the 1700s in rural New England areas, the idea of privacy started to become very important. They started building smaller fireplaces and larger baking ovens, which were much more efficient. It was a beehive oven now at this time. They built the built-in cabinet to display their set of pewter, which was so important to them. When they did build this addition, they also started building rooms for more specific purposes. And the next room is a good example of that. This is the buttery. And this is where the family would have made their dairy products. The buttery was always located on the north side of the house for its coolness, and the walls were always kept whitewashed for cleanliness. In 1785, Edmund, who was Joseph's grandson, Joseph, remember, being the one who built the 1725 edition, decided he wanted a part of his deceased father's estate. We've kind of skipped a generation here. So at that date, 1785, he legally divided the house. So now instead of seeing one family living under one roof, you found 2, maybe 3 families living under the same roof at the same time, but they had their own living spaces, and that's the way the house remained through the last of the generations to live here. In the 1800s, in middle-class New England homes, you'd usually find a room that was used exclusively for entertaining, and that's what the best room or the parlor was, which is this room right here. They held weddings and funerals and parties in this room. We know of 3 Coffin weddings that took place in this room. And they always kept the most expensive, most decorative furniture in the parlor. The last coffin to live in the house was Lucy Coffin. And during the 1800s, because of mass production and industrialization moving into the area, she was able to surround herself with a much more luxurious decor. She lived up here in this front part of the house. While she lived here, Joshua Coffin lived in the back part of the house, and he was an historian who wrote the old Book of Newbury, who is still well respected today. So this was Joshua's bedroom. He used this back, the original part of the house, with his living space, and they built this addition on around the 1800s. He made this his bedroom and his little study where he probably wrote the book that is still in circulation today. So what the Coffin House here is showing you is how a family of 12 living in 1-2 rooms grew and changed to one family living in 13 rooms, how the idea of privacy really became so important to the family, how luxurious and decorative things became because of the trades moving into rural New England areas. And like I said, the family never did have plumbing or heating here in the house, so there was still much to come after they left the area.
Now let us return to Newbury during the 1650s. Tristram had become a man of substance, but he was not comfortable with the petty, repressive restrictions that the Puritan authorities had placed on everyday life. An episode occurred at this time which dramatized the Puritan problem. Quakers were not welcome in Massachusetts or Plymouth. They were considered disruptive and heretics. No one was to associate with them. 3 came to Thomas Macy's house for shelter in a rainstorm. For this, he was admonished and fined. Once more, Tristram moved back to Salisbury, and it was there, with a like-minded group of men, he arranged to purchase Nantucket Island. The original 10 purchasers of Nantucket were Tristram Coffin, Sr., Thomas Macy, Richard Swain, Thomas Barnard, Peter Coffin, Christopher Hussey, Stephen Greenleaf, John Swain, William Pike, and Thomas Mayhew, from whom the English title was purchased. The contract was for £30 and 2 beaver hats. Several trips to Nantucket were made, and a separate purchase was made from the local Indians, who outnumbered the English. They received £26 and continued to live on the island. Tristram purchased Tuckernuck Island with his sons Peter, Tristram Jr., and James. In the fall of 1659, Thomas Macy moved his family to Nantucket. With him went Edward Starbuck, Isaac Coleman, and James Coffin. The following year, the Coffins moved to Nantucket. Tristram was now 55. The first lots were laid out by Capom Pond. 10 more full-share proprietors were added, among whom were Tristram Coffin Jr., James Coffin, Robert Pike, Robert Barnard, John Smith, Thomas Look, and Thomas Mayhew Sr. This meant there were 20 full-share proprietors. They felt the need for more settlers, men who would bring more skills, which an isolated, well-balanced community needed. These additional settlers were granted a half-share each. Among these half-share men were Peter Folger and the Gardner brothers Richard and John. Between the 20 proprietors and the half-share men come most of the names later to be associated with Nantucket. They intermarried with multiple frequency. The settlement around Capom Pond grew through the years. More plots of ground were surveyed and primitive homes were built, later to be replaced with more substantial buildings. As there were few trees native to the island, lumber had to be imported. Peter Coffin lived in Dover, New Hampshire, where he owned a sawmill and supplied much of that lumber. Here we see the falls that provided power for his sawmill. He made frequent trips to Nantucket, where he also maintained a home. Many of his descendants continued to live in Dover, this being the home of one of them. The first island marriage was between Mary Coffin and Nathaniel Starbuck. As he had no other surviving brothers, all who bear the name Starbuck are half Coffin. Mary became, in many ways, one of the most influential of the early settlers. She ran the first island store. It became known as Parliament House, as many meetings occurred there. Her advice and opinion were sought and considered. She was known to preface her remarks, "My husband and I, having considered the matter, believe..." It was Mary Coffin Starbuck who became a member of the Society of Friends, Quakers, and through her influence, the Quaker faith came to dominate Nantucket for many generations. The inequality of the half-share men continued. Not only did the proprietors get 2 votes, but could vote even if they lived on the mainland. Tristram carried over the concepts of the landed gentry of Old England. He felt the proprietors had title to the island and should be respected. The Gardner brothers and Peter Folger represented the new concept of one man, one vote. In maneuverings too complex to describe, they jockeyed for control, and eventually one man, one vote won, although Tristram continued as first magistrate. This period of tension left a reservoir of resentment between the Coffins and the Gardners. As inevitably happens in family quarrels, the blushing Mary Gardner, daughter of John Gardner, fell in love with Jethro Coffin, Peter Coffin's third child and Tristram's grandchild. Once the consternation settled, both families gallantly rose to the occasion and resolved their differences. The Coffins gave the lumber and the Gardners gave the land, and the Jethro Coffin House was built in 1686 on Sunset Hill as part of the settlement of Old Sherborne. Over a period of years, buildings were moved east to the town of Nantucket, but the Jethro Coffin House remained. Today, it is generally described as Nantucket's oldest house on its original foundation.
The room we're standing in is called the Great Hall, or East Room. It was a multi-purpose room, very much the way a family room in a contemporary home would be. The furnishings that you see in here are all authenticated and legitimate to the period. The furniture in here is very typical of furniture of the period in that it's relatively lightweight and quite portable. The room as you see it today is probably furnished very much the way it was when Mary and Jethro first lived here. Very sparsely furnished, to be sure. Theirs was a pretty Spartan existence. They didn't have much in the way of luxuries or frills. This is the room in which 90% of the household chores were accomplished. Here's the beehive oven. When they wanted to bake a loaf of bread or a pie, they would take a shovel, perhaps like that one there, and put a layer of hot coals from the fire, which was burning in this fireplace, onto the floor of the beehive oven. A layer of coals maybe 3 to 4 inches thick, and they'd cover the front of it with a piece of metal. After a couple of hours, they'd open it up again, rake out those coals, and put the material to be baked into the oven, and close it off one more time. This room over here is called the bourning room. It indeed is the room in which babies were delivered, and it was also used as a nursery when the kids were tiny. It being right here where the majority of the cooking and baking was done, it was one of the warmer rooms in the house. And also, because the lady of the house spent most of her time in this area taking care of chores and so on, she'd be right close by in case the child needed attention, and she'd be able to get in and care for it very quickly. Mary and Jethro lived here for 20 years, during which time they had 7 children, and at the end of that period they moved up to New Hampshire to take care of the family's lumber business. And the next family to move into the house was that of Nathaniel Paddock. He was a weaver who came from Providence, Rhode Island, and furthermore, we're talking now around 1710 or so, whaling was beginning to make a small but significant contribution to the economy of the island, and life was getting a little more gracious. The bed here is typical of beds of the period. In the cold weather months, they would put fabric hangings over this frame and pull them together when they went to bed at night. It would be like a little room or a tent all by itself, and those fabric hangings would keep the drafts out and the warmth in. Let's go upstairs and see what we've got up here. There are a couple of rooms that are kind of interesting to look at. The room at the very top of the stairs, quite a large room, we believe, was probably a master bedroom. The room across the hall here is shown to you as a bedroom would have been back when Mary and Jethro first lived here. Now, there are 5 rooms in this house, and you'll recall that Mary and Jethro had 7 children. And this made sense in this room here. You'll notice it has a fireplace, the only one on the 2nd floor of the building. And so when you had 3 or 4 kids in here all at the same time and a small fire going in the fireplace, this would be a nice warm and cozy room in the cold weather months.
The Capam Pond settlement, known as Sherborne, grew, but soon was replaced by the town of Nantucket, which had a much better harbor. While farming was the first activity, sheep raising became and remained the prime land use. It was inevitable that the sea would eventually dominate island life. The gardeners came as fishermen, and the Paddocks brought expertise in whaling. At first, whales were caught from shore stations. By 1720, the first offshore whaling was started, and soon whaling became the prime industry. By the American Revolution, Nantucket ships were whaling from Greenland to the southern reaches of the Brazil grounds. The Revolutionary War years were very difficult on Nantucket. An interesting note to mention, 2 of the ships which carried tea to the famous Boston Tea Party were actually Nantucket whale ships, which had carried whale oil to London and sought a return cargo. After 1790, whaling expanded rapidly. Nantucket ships rounded Cape Horn and visited Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, Japan, Africa, and the Indian Ocean. The world was explored in detail from the Arctic Ocean to the Antarctic. Literally, the whaling fleets of England and France were officered by Nantucket cousins. Nantucket colonies with branches of the Yearly Friends, that is Quaker meeting, were found in Nova Scotia, Milford Haven in Wales, Dunkirk in France, Hudson in New York, and New Bedford. New Bedford, with its deep-water mainland location, would eventually grow to supplant Nantucket itself. During the Revolution, the population was 5,000 and grew to 10,000 by 1840. The island was growing and flourishing. The descendants of Nantucket's first settlers dominated the world's whaling industry. The ethics, morals, and philosophy of the Quaker faith, with its emphasis on simple, plain living and the importance of the inner light, permeated island society. By this time, the dispersal of Tristram's offspring had begun. Surplus coffins moved to North Carolina, Ohio, and Indiana. The glory days of Nantucket whaling were from 1800 to 1840. Nantucket was the center of it all. Ship after ship sailed from its harbor, returning after some 3 years with countless barrels of oil and stories of the high seas. Let us get a short glimpse of that many repeated sequence of events that made up the life of a whaler. From the long hours of waiting to the exhilarating Nantucket sleigh ride.
The boats lower away. The boat is cast loose. The crew strains at the oars. The boat closes in on the prey. The harpooner drives his iron deep into the whale. The whale is stung into action. With incredible speed, he starts a wild dash, called by whalemen a Nantucket sleigh ride. There it goes, deep into the whale. The work of cutting in the blubber begins. The blubber is cut into sections and tossed into the kettles built in the brick try-works on deck.
Nantucket was full of warehouses, counting houses, candle works, whale oil refineries, rope walks, and whale boat builders. All of the facilities needed to supply and refit the whaling fleet occupied the waterfront and the lives of Nantucketers. Great wealth flowed into the island. The simplicity of earlier Quaker lifestyle became eroded. The early Nantucket half house was replaced with imposing Greek Revival mansions. Dating from this period are the Coffin School, gift of Sir Isaac Coffin, the Tory British admiral, who was concerned for the education of his island cousins, the Pacific Bank, the Athenaeum, and the Unitarian Church. Nantucket was maturing with many beautiful and picturesque buildings and views. There is no view of Nantucket like that from the tower of the Congregational Church. Tristram's legacy has spread to every state and Canadian province and to the whole world. Tristram Sr. had 9 children, 7 who grew to marry. He left 75 grandchildren, 60 of whom grew to marry. All coffins seem to retain the knowledge of their ancestry to the 14th generation in America and through many intermarriages. All have a deep loyalty and nostalgia to their remarkable heritage.